Welcome to episode 195 of the Daniel Yoris podcast with today's guest, Brianna Houston. Let's go. Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. Joined here today by Brianna Houston. Bri, thanks so much for being here. Appreciate you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Daniel, for having me. I'm super excited.
I'm very excited for this conversation because it is going to be, of course, an important conversation, but something that I'm going to be doing a lot of learning in this conversation, as well as hopefully the potential listener, because this is an area of fitness and nutrition that, of course, I know, some of the basics, because the basics are always the same and go across everything. But there's a lot of more details that, obviously I just don't specialize in and I just don't know about because it's just not in my wheelhouse and really in my world. So I'm super excited to talk to you today. But before we kind of get to that and, a little bit of foreshadowing there, can you introduce yourself, let people know who you are and what it is that you do?
Totally. Hi, I'm Brianna Houston. I am an orthopedic and pelvic floor rehabilitation specialist. So for the last 4.5 years, I've worked with the trying to conceive prenatal and postpartum populations. And then prior to that, I was working with clients a little bit closer to physical therapy and kind of in the rehab setting. So I work with them on rehabilitation and then getting back into the gym or sport or athleticism, whatever that may look like.
Amazing. Just as a quick note to the listeners, I think we're dealing with some internet connection issues, so just bear with us. We're going to get through it, and it's going to be all fine, but just bear with us for a second. So, Bri, you guys also just moved to Colorado, which is a huge environment thing. I think that's going to kind of frame a little bit of our situation, of our conversation rather. That the environment that you live in is also really important to just the things that happen as far as how you move, how you eat, what things are available to you, the knowledge that you have. One thing that I came across this morning, actually, as I was just preparing for this conversation a little bit, and maybe we'll start here, is that menopause is experienced very differently around the world. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if this is a 100% true, because I just read an article. I didn't bother to do a deep dive on the research. However, as far as some of the symptoms of menopause, I think hot flashes are probably one of the main ones, and we've all heard of women who deal with hot flashes. In Japan, this concept of hot flashes, there wasn't even a Japanese term for it until very recently, and that made me think oh, okay, well, what is happening here? And so there are these environmental differences, and so I'm not sure that I have an exact question for you with that. But have you heard of this, and do people experience, do we have these very different menopausal experiences and probably pre and postnatal experiences with fitness and pelvic floor and all this stuff? Yes. Are there very different experiences around the world?
Absolutely. I would say that your environment and you mentioned, your access to education, nutrition, your athleticism even, has everything to do with your menopausal experience, your prenatal, your postpartum experience, your motherhood journey. Yes, all of that can take effect. And certainly, environments of high stress, and how your body and nervous system responds to that stress, can certainly affect performance, energy levels, all the things. So yeah, I would definitely say that all of that affects your menopausal experience and just as a woman experience.
So is it a stretch to say, and maybe this is a little bit of extreme and obviously caveats to every scenario, but is it a stretch to say that a lot of the very common negative symptoms, if you will, of menopause in North America are not necessarily normal, and they are more a cause of our North American environment, and if we were living in more in harmony with whatever the world, we would have less of that? Is that fair to say?
I don't think it's a stretch to say that. Yes, it's fair. Because we tend to live in higher stress environments. Your nervous system being heightened actually makes you more susceptible to feeling pain or feeling certain symptoms. So yeah, I would say that has a lot to do with it.
Interesting. Okay, that was really kind of stumping me this morning. And when I read it, I was like, this sounds logical. A lot of the stuff that we do in North America is just non harmonious with like the world and our own bodies. And that's not like, I think not just in menopause, just with everything. Yeah. And I was like, okay, well, I don't know enough about this to like make this claim. So like, let me like ask someone who does. But I think this is a good framing of our conversation, because the reason why I wanted to start with this is that I think that we can change what we're doing, the way we eat, the way we move, the way we, set up our lifestyle, supplementation, all of the things to have like a better experience in the prenatal, postnatal, motherhood, menopause, the whole journey through it. And so that's kind of, I think, where we want to take it. So, so let's start from the beginning. Yeah. What are, and beginning as in like timeline through life. What are some of the major considerations for people who are in like the prenatal stage of life, maybe hoping to conceive soon or in the next couple of years? What are the main considerations? And let's start with movement, because I know that that's like your primary wheelhouse, and then we can expand into nutrition and other stuff. But what are the main like movement, exercise considerations for someone in that stage of life?
Yeah. So if you are like in your like trying to conceive era, I would say. So like you're not physically trying to conceive yet, but you're like, I want to have kids. Certainly getting to know your pelvic floor. So actually like looking at it, just kind of taking note of like how it responds to certain things, because I think a lot of us like can feel pain and then just keep going throughout our day. Or you're like, oh, like I just leaked a little bit, but like, I was dancing and like, I had a lot to drink and it was fine. But like, these are actually issues that like need to be addressed. So I would say if that's happening, if you have any type of pain or any type of dysfunction in your like trying to conceive era, those certainly need to be addressed. If you're in your trying to conceive era, you certainly need to be focusing on like coordinating your pelvic floor with the rest of your core. Building out really strong stability through your hips, and in and around your trunk. I can add shoulders to that as well, because it's all connected and it all matters. But certainly building up strength through your core space and through your hips is going to be like the biggest gift that you can give yourself, because once you do get pregnant, you are going to be basically under the most physical demand your body has ever been in. So yeah, it's only going to benefit you to start your movement practice as soon as possible, get to know your pelvic floor, and then kind of connecting and coordinating that into your like strength program.
So when you say look at your pelvic floor, how does one do that? Like how do we start to assess this? What if you have no symptoms? Like what do you mean when you say look at your pelvic floor?
Yeah. Well, it's a little bit easier for men to look at their parts because it's outside of the body. But when I say look at your pelvic floor, I'm saying like you and a mirror, like get down on the ground. You do have to spread your legs and take a peek.
Physically actually look at it.
Yes. So physically look at your pelvic floor, because I know, I guess that could have gone the other way too. But, yes, get to know your pelvic floor means like physically looking at it. And then also like, I know a lot of women are like tracking their cycles on apps these days. So like actually getting to know your pelvic floor as in like, what's your mucus like this week and next week? And what's your pelvic floor feeling like when you're on your period, or when you're ovulating, that kind of thing.
Right. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. I'm going to take us on a quick sidebar here. One, just to highlight the importance of the general theme that I say like 8 million times in this podcast is like paying attention and being super aware of the things that you're doing and the things that are actually happening is paramount to your fitness and health success. Like if you're not tracking your steps, you don't know how many steps you're taking. If you're not tracking your food in some way, like you have no idea what you're eating and how to change it. And when you say I want to eat better, you don't even know what that means. And so tracking things related to your pelvic floor and your female health is no different than that. You've got to get real clear on what's actually happening.
Correct.
Now as a little sidebar here, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that it's good to just have that like baseline measurement of what your normal is. And again, like it's best to try to establish that in your like trying to conceive, but if you do it during prenatal, like it's just good to have that like baseline measurement so you have something to compare it to, because once birth takes place and postpartum, things are going to feel, look very, very different. So it's good to just have something to compare to.
Right. Yeah. Makes a ton of sense. Like you should track your health in your quote unquote normal state, right? And then that way you have something to like a control group to compare it to. Now the little sidebar that I wanted to take here was in tracking menstrual cycles. There's been a lot said, and again, not my super like wheelhouse, about tailoring one's training and nutrition to different parts of your cycle or different times through your cycle, different sections of the cycle, whatever the correct terminology is there.
Yes.
But I've also seen like so much back and forth on this where some people say like, hey, that doesn't matter at all. Like just do what you feel like. And then some people are like, no, you should only be doing, heavy training on this week and eat more carbs on this week and whatever. Where's your, like, what are your opinions and thoughts on that kind of like syncing up your training and nutrition to your cycle?
Yeah. So yeah, we call them phases. But I also like to look at them as like a very small season. Yeah, perfect. So basically if you break it up into like a month cycle, right? We'll say 4 weeks. This could be like plus or minus though, because some women have shorter cycles, some women have longer cycles. So that's something you also want to get to know about yourself. Like how long is this phase going to last? But at the same time, there might be months where the phases are different and things are fluctuating. And that's based on like stuff you're eating or how you're moving. So all those other like environmental factors we were discussing too. Like if there's a high stress situation at home, that can affect the phases as well. And I'm sorry to answer, what was your question? You were saying, how do I look at how we sync these things up in terms of fitness? Like I'm looking at like, yes, you're like knowing the general cycle or what it should be. And then I'm kind of like matching, based on feeling, but it's a balance too, right? So like if we're looking at your period, right? This is when your hormones are going to be the lowest. So you're likely not going to feel like getting into a high intensity workout or anything like that. But I do believe you should be working out at that time. Now, what does that workout look like? It needs to be focused on like your pelvic floor, right? Because pelvic floor, typically around your period, you're a little bit more bloated. There's inflammation in the space. Your pelvic floor connection might not even like be there, but we do want to establish that and keep coordinating that because that's going to affect how your body responds in the next phase or next week, right? When your hormones start to come up again. So I think you should always be doing a little something no matter what phase you're in. That intensity is going to differ from person to person and also where they're starting at. So if we have like a not so athletic person, they might be, really focused on just those kind of slower stability, more like intentional connection to their core type movements. Whereas someone more athletic on their period, they might be super stable and they might have a connection already there. So they could probably jump into squat lunges, hinges at that time if they feel like it. Right. So again, like it is that balance of like feeling, but also your ability, and like like where your athleticism is at. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. So would you say then that if someone is like feeling good on the week of your period where you're not feeling abnormally bloated or super like in pain or uncomfortable or very inflamed, like you just feel totally normal for whatever reason, would you still advise that person to adjust their training a little bit? Or it's like, if you feel good, then just like go get after it?
Yes, I still would advise you to adjust your training. And it doesn't mean you can't do squats or you can't run, but let's just like lower the intensity. And like that could look like lowering the weight. That could look like slowing down your pace. It really just depends.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. I mean, I've trained many women, and it's always different. Like I've tried, we try to make like rules of things because it just makes our life simpler. Like, okay, everyone fits in this box, and then you realize like very quickly that like that doesn't work at all. Like, I've had some female clients who like the week of their period, it's like, hey, we're like we're training, we're doing stuff, we're walking at least, but like this is obviously like not your PR week.
Correct. Yeah.
And then there's some who it's like I barely even. Like they barely even notice it, right? You can't tell unless you're asking and having open conversations about it. But based on like numbers and training, it's like things look the same and whatever. So it's always so interesting to me. But it does make sense. Again, just thinking very logically, and as a man who doesn't have a menstrual cycle, like it makes sense that your body you should make some even small adjustments whether you're feeling something or not. And it's not even that dissimilar to like a regular deload week where it's like, hey, if you've been like pounding the weights for like 6 weeks in a row and like, nailing every workout, like probably do you some good to like take a week to just like taper off a little bit and then come back and hit it hard again. Just normal recovery of the body as well.
Exactly. Yeah. And I actually always see women perform better when they do take that just small adjustment to their training, a little break, and then you come back so much stronger. So yeah, that's something to consider as well. I think the women, like especially in the pre-postnatal era, like some women who are a little more athletic or used to training at a certain, speed or expectation, like there is a lot of education and conversation around just saying, hey, your brain might be telling you that you need to work out and you need to hit this regimen because you've been doing this for X amount of time. But the prenatal season is going to be a big kind of like check on yourself, especially like the mental aspect. I call it athlete brain, but kind of just like turning that off a little bit and saying like, hey, I can do this, but should I do this? That is kind of like the theme throughout that whole prenatal season.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. The athlete brain is a perfect word for that. And like as coaches, when you coach athletes like or former athletes, you spend more time trying to like rein them in. It's like, okay, we don't need to like hit a massive PR every single workout. Like it's okay. Versus most people out there, it's like we're trying to fire them up and get them going. Like, okay, we can add a little bit more, like 1 more pound maybe is okay. Like 1 more rep, it's totally. two different kind of things. But for sure, it's like, yeah, just because you can doesn't necessarily mean that you should. And like while you're pregnant or just after giving birth is probably not your time to be hitting your squat PRs. I mean,
correct.
there's plenty of time for that. So we think about fitness as like the super long game, right? So
exactly.
Speaking a little bit more technically then, to someone who is like in their prenatal, maybe they're thinking about conceiving soon or just recently got pregnant, why is training so important? In addition to all of like the just generic health benefits to training, but how does it actually help with the pregnancy?
Yeah. So because your body is going to be placed under so much physical demand, we certainly want to focus on stability and strength. So it's going to help with growth of the baby because we're getting blood flow and heat through the core space. It's going to support you and the growth that's to come. So I think I was saying before, like someone who comes in, already having like low back pain, right? And they're like, hey, I'm pregnant now. It's like, okay, we should expect that symptom increases, over time, but let's put some tools in place, some stability work, some homework for you to be doing so that we don't have to run into that symptom or worse symptoms, down the line. So strength is incredibly important during the trying to conceive and prenatal era, but it's also very important because the postpartum recovery and just becoming a mom and being a mom requires strength. You're going to be carrying, lifting, holding, passing off baby and feeding baby. So the And I think we can say this is true of like anyone who's doing repetitive movements, repetitive motions. Those muscles get tired and exhausted, and they tend to give out and or go on vacation. So in order to kind of remind the muscles, hey, you have a job, and it is to support mother as well as in order to support baby. And that's the kind of like work that we do is like, it may not be like your hardest workout ever, but this is going to coordinate the muscles so that they are able to support you now and into the next season. Something I do want to highlight is that strength has nothing to do with the birth outcome itself. So like you could be, and this is what I kind of love about prenatal strength, is that like it kind of levels out the field. So whether you have a super athletic body or a not so athletic body, both of these women can be doing prenatal strength, but their birth outcomes can be completely different experiences, and that's okay. So we really want to just focus on like the prenatal strength influencing postpartum recovery. And yes, it's going to help with birth and assist you with birth, but it has nothing to do with the outcome of the birth itself.
I think that is a super important distinction to make, and not something that I probably would have connected myself, to be honest. I would have thought that being stronger would have had quite a bit of a bigger influence on like the actual process of giving birth as well, but framing it as in like, hey, this is going to help you out like way more afterwards in the recovery and just in your general life, because once baby comes, like life gets crazy. And I don't know anyone who's like, oh, I just had a baby, I'm like dialed in the gym 6 days a week, an hour and a half every day. Like I don't think that that's ever happened in the history of the world. And
women try to do that,
that's again not the time where you're like, all right, now that I yeah, exactly. But it's like it's this whole theme of like you need to build up your strength when you're able to, because a time is coming, whether it be postnatal or like a crazy accident or any other thing not related to birth at all, where it's like, hey, now you need this strength, and you can't be building up strength when you need it. You just need to already have access to it. And so it's easier to do that when you have less things or humans pulling at you, literally or figuratively.
Exactly.
So when we talk about the pelvic floor then, exercises, recommendations, how do we actually go about thinking about, because it's probably not something most people have thought about, like how do I actually like feel my pelvic floor? What exercises do I do? How do I actually do this so that I can start to strengthen this as well as strengthen the rest of my body?
Absolutely. Yeah. So of course, pelvic floor muscle is the main one that we are thinking about throughout prenatal and postpartum strength. But it's good to know that just your pelvic floor is a part of your core, right? So when we say, we kind of like separate the two, but really when we're saying core and speaking of a woman's core, it's your pelvic floor, your transverse abdominis, your multifidi, and your rectus, right? So a lot of times we say core and everyone thinks those 6-pack abs. And yes, that's what we mean, but we mean all these other muscles in between as well. So in terms of getting connected to your pelvic floor, the first thing that you're going to need to do is breathe efficiently. So diaphragmatic breathing is going to be your best friend for connection, but also throughout training. So for my more athletic clients, who are used to maybe like powerlifting and getting into more of like that Valsalva maneuver because it helps stabilize the spine, et cetera, et cetera. I have to kind of break down the breath a little bit more for these folks and get them to really start exhaling throughout the movement, which can be a little tricky at first. But once they find that access and realize that exhaling and engages their pelvic floor so much more, and they're actually able to produce more force because now their whole core is working together. So really the pelvic floor just optimizes function of your entire core. When or as baby is growing, there's a lot more pressure on the pelvic floor muscle in particular, which again is why we want to establish connection early on. But we also want to keep that muscle moving. And when I say moving, I mean like as you inhale, that muscle is going to relax. And as you exhale, that muscle is going to contract. So it has to be doing that throughout your work, because otherwise you are placing more tension on it when there's already an increased demand there. So once you've established connection with the breath and you're able to apply that into your movements, then you're kind of like golden from there. There are different, I want to call them modes of the pelvic floor. So I mentioned the pelvic floor needs to relax and contract. That evenness of length and contraction creates a lot of balance. So that's the first thing we want to get, is like ensuring that there's not too much tone, there's not too much laxicity. We're able to do both. Then there's this mechanism of pelvic floor where we do want it to brace and hold on to tension, because that's going to be good for things like planks, and just activities that demand a little bit more of the body, like squats, deadlifts, split squats, lunges, that kind of thing. And then we also want the pelvic floor to be able to relax and contract quickly. So that's like the fast twitch kind of mechanism of the pelvic floor, which is great for heavy impact movements like running, plyometrics. And actually that one is going to also be good for sex and the ability to orgasm. So yeah, allowing your pelvic floor to be able to do all of those things would be like optimal functioning of pelvic floor. In terms of exercises that promote pelvic floor connection activation, we're looking at adductor stretches. So inner thighs, I see the inner thighs as like an extension of your core. So anything that's your midline, so from your vagina and down, the pelvic floor muscles, the inner thigh muscles, and even your plantar fascia all have this really deep connection. So if we're doing exercises that strengthen inner thighs, we're likely strengthening pelvic floor. What I think folks get confused with, you may have seen girls, I don't know, on Instagram and whatever, like holding weights in their vagina. Or maybe they're like practicing like that slurping mechanism.
I have not seen that.
Oh, you haven't? Okay. Well, yeah, it's out there. So this is like more of a, people are like, I really want to get my pelvic floor strong. So they start practicing like all this weighted hold in your pelvic floor. And yes, that is a like physical therapy technique, that actually helps women, one, locate their pelvic floor, get connected to the space and strengthen it. But your pelvic floor, like at some point, your pelvic floor just needs to be like reflexive, meaning like you inhale, it lengthens. You exhale, it contracts. You don't want to always have to be intentional with your pelvic floor. Like it should be naturally like moving with you. And only 40% contraction of pelvic floor is really necessary for force, like proper force production, right? The rest of that engagement or support should come from the abdominals and the glutes. So I know a lot of girlies, like when they first start out with pelvic floor, they like do all these crazy kegels. They're like, I'm kegeling 50 times a day. And that actually just puts more tension on the pelvic floor. And again, if you're pregnant and you're doing those kegels, like that's a lot of tension on your pelvic floor. So you do want to be able to have this like intentional connection, but then you also want to trust that your body knows what it's doing. And when you're doing a heavy lift, you don't want to have to say pelvic floor engage, right? Your core and your glutes should be supporting the pelvic floor and kind of doing the rest of that lift. I know that was kind of long-winded, but
no, that's a lot, but that's perfect. I mean, I think for sure I needed to hear that. But when we think of anything as a muscle, we typically, like, I think the default thought is like, well, I want it to be like as strong as possible and contract as hard as it can contract.
Yes. But
most muscles are not like that, actually, and especially your pelvic floor, because it has way more functions as opposed to like just, lift heavy stuff. And even like your biceps, your quads, like you don't want them to be super tight and super like on all the time. You want them to relax when they need to relax and contract when they need to contract. And maybe the theme here is like control. And that's probably why you start a lot with the breath work, because that's where you learn to actually control and tense when you need to tense, and then relax when you need to relax. And once you get that down, the strength training exercises become a lot easier.
Correct. Yeah. That's the perfect way to put that.
It's like when you have someone who's a pretty much like a beginner in the gym, and you're asking them to do any exercise, say squats, and you're like, okay, squeeze your quads. And you know, you can tell they look at their quads is always the first thing. They look down at their eyes. And they're like, nothing's happening in the quad. Like it's not moving. And like, I can tell that like you're trying to, but like your brain is trying to send a message down there, and you know what it's supposed to be happening, but it's just like not happening. And it's not your fault. It's just, you haven't learned how to do this. But so the pelvic floor would be no different, but probably harder to learn how to control, only because it's internal, and it's not a muscle that you can isolate so easily using like it's pretty easy to learn how to flex your bicep, because like you can do a dumbbell curl that is very easy movement to do that with. Other muscles are harder, but pelvic floor probably one of the more difficult ways, and probably getting down on the floor, lying flat on your back, maybe, and doing breath work is probably one of the better ways to do that.
Exactly. Yeah. Breath work, again, is where it all begins. The pelvic floor will respond best to an inhale through the nose and an exhale out the mouth. The inhale through the nose, right? We're taking air in, we're taking pressure in. So everything should be kind of inflating like a balloon and lengthening out. Whereas when we exhale out the mouth, we want to pull pelvic floor up and then draw the abdominals in. I'm picky about the exhales out the mouth for a few reasons. In pregnancy, again, the high physical demand also creates a lot of heat through the body. And if we're not exhaling out the mouth, then we're kind of like overproducing. We're adding to the overproduction of heat that's already there. And that can affect energy levels and force output, et cetera, et cetera. So we want to be clear about exhaling out the mouth just about in every strength move you do, but also in your stretches and in your mobility as well, because that exhale out the mouth is going to allow you to engage your core so that you're supported through the stretch. Because a lot of women can get into ranges of motion that they weren't exactly ready for. And then they end up with aches, pains, etc. So I'm really picky about that breath. The pursing of the lips is also really important, because our pelvic floor and our glottis, your throat, they have very similar structures, or like they look very similar. So the pursing of your lips, mimicking the shape and size of your vagina, is actually the best way to get the pelvic floor to respond. So that's a really helpful tool that I give to clients. I know it sounds a little funky, but it's just what it is. Our mouths and vaginas are very similar.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense to me, again, just like not something I've ever heard of or would have come to that conclusion, but it makes sense, that you want to be able to find ways to do it the same way we were just talking about a bicep curl, where it's very easy. Put a weight in your hand, curl it up, you can feel that. Okay, so how can we mimic that? Learn how to flex your bicep thing for the pelvic floor. We got to use some sort of external cues and some things, like we can all move our mouth, and that's something that we're familiar with. And so if that, by whatever means, helps to flex and relax and feel and use your pelvic floor, then great.
Exactly.
Are there any favorite or go-to like breathwork protocols that you use as far as like length of inhale, exhale? I'm sure there's thousands of them, but is there any favorites that you have?
Yes. So when we're first starting out, I mentioned before about there needing to be a balance between the lengthening phase and contracting phase. So at first, when I'm coaching the breath, I may not be as picky about like the timing, but let's say someone was having a hard time connecting to the pelvic floor. I would then say try to inhale until you cannot anymore. So that could look like 4 or 5 seconds, depending on the person. If they're a little bit more hypertonic, which means their pelvic floor is just holding on to tension and it's not moving with that inhale, then I kind of have to coach direction of the breath. So I say, think of inhaling into your holes, or when you inhale, bringing that pressure down into your pelvic floor. Gravity is a great tool as well. So if we think of gravity, right, everything's pulling down. Your inhale, or that lengthening phase, everything should be moving down towards the holes. And then the exhale, right, we're pulling up and in. Usually the exhale is a little bit easier for folks. So that's why I emphasize that inhale phase. But in terms of like different breath strategies, once connection is made, sometimes like women will come to me and they're like, hey, like my rib cage is really hurting. Or I have this pain in my side and like, I can't seem to stretch. They'll put their arm over their head and they're like, I feel like it should be stretching, but it's not really stretching. It's usually the breath, that can open up that space. So we come back to that diaphragmatic inhale, and we can really think of like that upper diaphragm and your pelvic floor as a second diaphragm. So if we're lengthening both of those diaphragms out and we're breathing into that rib cage, there's likely going to be some lengthened space through pelvic floor. So in terms of like getting out of that rib cage pain, I might put them in the stretch that they're like, oh yeah, this is like what I'm trying to open up, but it's not so much working. So I'll put them in the stretch and then I'll have them inhale into that space as long as deep as they possibly can. I'll have them hold for about 4 to 5 seconds. So here's where I do start to like, I don't like breath holding, but sometimes it's necessary. I'll have them hold the inhale for about 4 to 5 seconds, and then we'll exhale and let it all go. We'll repeat that maybe 4 or 5 times, and usually that pain in their rib cage subsides. So knowing how to manipulate the breath and utilize that to your advantage can be super, super helpful for managing pain, getting out of pain, and then, of course, making the connection to that pelvic floor.
When you say that you don't really like the breath holding, is that more in terms of like using the Valsalva maneuver, which if you, just in case anyone doesn't know, it's like when you hold your breath and you like breathe out but don't let the air out, like you hunker down when you're about to lift something heavy. Are you saying that you don't like that during pregnancy because it's creating too much pressure, or is that what you're meaning?
Correct. Yeah. The Valsalva maneuver is something I do not coach prenatally, because there is so much pressure already taking place. So it's not going to be very beneficial or useful. And then we talked about heat, right? So letting go of that heat means letting go of that tension and ridding the body of that unnecessary kind of pressure. Postpartum, it might be useful to use a Valsalva maneuver, depending on like the symptoms or the experience that mom is having. So for example, there's something called prolapse. Pelvic organ prolapse is when your organs have either fallen through your vaginal canal or rectal canal, sometimes both. But a Valsalva maneuver would actually be super helpful in that case for some, because you're creating tension and holding onto tension, which allows you to pull the organs back up into position. So it can be useful, but yeah, during pregnancy, like I just don't think it's a good idea. It's not that I'm uncomfortable with it, but I think that clients will not get the benefits that we're looking for during pregnancy by utilizing that.
Right. Makes sense. And I think for what it's worth, it's important to say that the Valsalva maneuver, even if you've never heard that term before, it's probably something you do just naturally. Like when you bend over to pick something up that's heavy, like we all do this. You just kind of hold your breath and you bear down and you pick it up. And so the idea, if you are pregnant and lifting, is like you would have to almost consciously not do it would be the thing. Like if you don't know that you're doing it, you probably are doing it. You have to consciously not do it. But having said that, then are there other specific exercises that you would advise against during pregnancy?
Yeah, great question. Really quick, you mentioned bearing down. And I'm so glad you used that term because that's something that we use a lot too. Yeah, that bearing down maneuver is only going to place more pressure downward on the pelvic floor, and baby gravity, potentially your breath strategy and the movement is placing a lot of pressure on that pelvic floor. So that's also a reason why, we don't want to get into that. So thank you for kind of linking that to kind of the Gen Pop. We're already doing that, a ton of that. So we kind of want to like readdress and reassess that during pregnancy and postpartum. But in terms of exercises that I would avoid during pregnancy or prenatal strength, I don't like to do do's and don'ts because every body is so different. In terms of like what we're looking out for, we don't want to see what's known as coning and doming in exercises. Coning and doming, it basically just looks like this shark fin that comes up along the midline of your tummy. And what that is pressure that's not being managed optimally. So it's nothing to be afraid of. It's not going to cause, anything. It doesn't mean that you're going to end up with diastasis, which is abdominal separation or anything. But it is something that we want to address. So for example, if I have a client that I've put into a plank position down on the ground and I'm seeing her cone and dome, I might address her breath strategy first, right? Just to see, because maybe she wasn't connected to her full 360 core. Maybe we can manipulate that first. If she's still unable to, manage that pressure, then we modify. Then we're going to come up to more of an incline plank position, hands on a countertop, tabletop, box, whatever. A place where she can manage that pressure a little bit better, right? So she might get stronger throughout the pregnancy, which is great. And we might be able to come back to the floor space. But there is a point in pregnancy where, there's just too much tension and pressure. And that's usually going to be towards the end, third trimester. I would just say avoiding, if you are noticing that cone and dome, adjusting your breath strategy and then modifying from there. But as far as like just movement in general, any movement is good. We certainly want to emphasize squats, hinges, and lunges. And then all the variations of carries because you're going to be, again, carrying, lifting, and holding all the freaking time. So just making sure that she's able to manage pressure in all of these scenarios. And then if you get to a point where the pressure is unmanageable, then we ditch it. And again, like it's a temporary season, right? Pregnancy will end. And we can come back to those exercises later. Yeah. Were there any exercises in particular you were thinking of that we might want to avoid?
I wouldn't have guessed that there's any that should have been avoided. And I'm so happy that you like rerouted the question to like signs of things to look for that like, hey, there's no actual exercises that are just blanket. Let's never do them. But like, if this is happening, then here's something to like look out for and then how to make those adjustments. I think that's like super helpful. I would have guessed that the some of the squats and deadlifts, like the heavier lifts, and this is just things that I hear where people would be like more afraid to do them just because they're building up pressure or just that it's heavier weight in general. Now, obviously, you could just do them with lighter weight. I say obvious to us, you could do it with lighter weight, but like you can just maybe instead of squatting 200 pounds, like you squat 50 pounds in a goblet squat and that's totally fine. You're still getting the movement in, you're still, all that stuff. What about someone who is like maybe a little bit more athletic, any type of like plyometric, Olympic lifting, kind of like more explosive movements? Are there any considerations against something like that?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that. So eventually like impact work, we're going to have to kind of like tailor that down a little bit. So that's what I was saying, I think before, just the athlete brain, someone who is used to doing things a certain way and, exerting a certain amount of force, that's someone that we might have to have a little bit more conversation and education with. Because again, like your pelvic floor is working so hard, your core is working so hard. So you're going to get to a point in pregnancy where either your body will tell you, hey, this doesn't feel good right now, right? So you'll see that coning doming, or you'll feel that hip pain, that pubic symphysis, that lightning crotch, will come up. And then naturally you should be like, oh, hey, I'm in pain. I should probably stop this. But sometimes that athlete brain runs wild and women are like, no, I'm going to keep lifting because this is what I know. So we can adjust again, like the resistance. So bigger, heavier lifts. Like I don't like to see women in their third trimester still deadlifting 225. Like please, like that is not impressive to me. And really it shouldn't be impressive to anyone else, because at that point in time, it's just not going to benefit the rest of your pregnancy, the birth or the postpartum recovery. Right. So yeah, I would like to see more athletic women starting to modify their exercise regimen. And again, it doesn't mean you can never do this again. It's just for right now. So typically I do kind of like switch it up. If they're used to just functional strength, then I kind of want you to be doing more like, more fluid movements, like a squat kettlebell clean. Like kettlebells are a great thing to kind of incorporate into the work, especially if the barbell work is no longer working for you. But again, especially once you get to that point in your pregnancy where the barbell work is actually making you move inefficiently, right? Because the belly is going to be there. And a lot of women continue trying to lift with the barbell and they have to move it around the belly. So now we're training an inefficient movement pattern. That's not going to work. Definitely not going to work postpartum. So I'd rather see you switch out your equipment. I'd rather you try something new and different. And then I'd rather you focus more on motherhood movements. And that always, like, for some reason freaks all the athletes out. Like, they're like, oh, I'm going to be stuck in this motherhood and this is all I can do for the rest of my life. No, that's not true. It's just what we want to prepare for. So I'd rather see you do a dumbbell deadlift curl, because that's going to mimic picking up your child. I'd rather you do a half kneeling wood chop, because that's going to mimic bringing your baby from tummy time, passing to your partner, or from the car seat to your partner. I'd rather work on like split stance get-ups and stuff like that, and balance and footwork, because by the end of pregnancy, there's a lot of pressure on the plantar fascia, and women are like, oh, my feet grew, and my feet are flat. And yes, that's all true. There's some swelling, but it's also just due to the weight, as well as like the priority, right? So if we know that that weight is going to increase and affect the feet, let's start doing footwork at weeks like 30 or so, or at least incorporating it into your workout. And that kind of stuff, right? The stuff that we're like not thinking about is the stuff that becomes so supportive to your bigger, heavier lifts later on. So, yeah.
No, that makes a ton of sense. That's so perfect to say, because I think one thing that just in general, in this context, in this population, and just in any population of people, we have to think about like, what's the point of the training? Like, what are we actually trying to do? And during your pregnancy, like you are not trying to hit squat PRs. Like that is not the time for that. And so you have to train for what your body is doing and about to do and is about to happen. And so if you have to, not touch a barbell for a few months, like that's okay, because you're doing something like frankly way more important than lifting weights, which is preparing your body to birth a child, like and then care for that child afterwards. And then you can certainly come back to them. Like no one said you have to never squat or deadlift again. Like there's plenty of time for that. Like you just, you have a few months where maybe you don't do that, and think about what the actual point of your training is. Now we've been talking a little bit about in terms of training, like, dialing back the athlete brain and how to modify exercise. What about someone who is pregnant but is not a former athlete, hasn't really been strength training? Maybe they go to the gym or do some classes and whatever here and there, but like they're not really in a routine. But they're listening to this podcast and like, oh shit, I should I should get on training. How does that person, like they're not going in and hitting deadlifts and heavy stuff because they're not even training? What should that person do? Should it look different? Should it be modified even more? Like, what would you say to that person?
Yeah, if they're just starting out in strength, like as a pregnant person, that's fantastic. I think that it's a great time to start strength training if you never have before, because this is that season where you can, just like the athlete, you're going to ask yourself, hey, how has my athleticism or lack of athleticism, how is that going to affect what's going to happen to my body in this season as well as the next? So I do love that mindset, just starting off with that and then letting them know and educating them that we need to be stable for this pregnancy to, for you to feel good and for you to continue being able to do the functional tasks that you need to, especially if, she's a working woman and, she has to commute or whatever, in this pregnant body. When I lived in New York, it was a lot of women that were, walking to and from work. So making sure that she is able to walk, and I know that sounds crazy, but making sure that you are putting the tools in place so that you are able to function properly, while this baby is growing. So for that person, I am starting them off with, and almost everyone I start everyone off with stability work. I don't care like whether you've been training for 20 years, whatever, you need the stability work at this point in time, because that's going to be your homework for now until postpartum, pretty much. Because there are going to be days where you don't feel like exerting a lot of force. There are going to be weeks that you might miss the session, right? And we have to kind of like adjust to that. So starting them with stability work, that's going to be like clamshells, all your glute med stuff. The breath, right? Getting the breath in these postures. So making sure that transverse abdominis is accessible. Marches. So that's like lying flat on your back and then, driving one knee up at a time. That mimics walking. So that's why that's one of my favorites. Also, bird dogs, beast hovers, bridges, so important. Anything that gets our glutes fired up is going to be the right thing, for someone who's just starting strength. And then we're thinking about posture as well. So someone who's not used to working out, I typically tend to see a little bit more rounding in the upper back. Pregnancy, because the belly is pulling everything forward, it's only going to pull those shoulders and the spine into more flexion. So getting into postural work. So banded exercises, scapular squeezes, things like that. So rows are like a huge, one of the exercises that like you will see in every prenatal strength program. We're doing rows. Yeah.
Should see that in every program ever, basically. I've never seen even a remotely good strength program that doesn't include some form of rows. But I mean, it gives another frame of reference as to like why it's important in that population, right? This is the thing that I think matters. Like I've heard this, tangentially through other women where it's like, who cares? I'm not trying to get jacked while I'm pregnant. I'm like, it's not that. Like that's not what you're trying to do. Right. Yeah. And so when we can think about it like, hey, your posture is going to be folded forward because you're going to have a big belly and that's all fine and beautiful and wonderful. But like, we need you to be able to stand up straight because you need you to be able to stand up straight because it's just going to make your life a lot easier and make you feel better. And so then we flip that switch from like, hey, this is not about like getting jacked and getting big muscles and losing weight or any of those other like, dare I say, silly things that we talk about in fitness all the time that are like cool, but like real low on the less important things. Like this is going to be so much more impactful in so many other ways.
Right. Yeah. And then looking at postpartum, right? Your entire everything is going to be forward, like kind of leaning over posture, right? So it's just reinforcing that roundedness. So yeah, like I really want to make sure that those stabilizers are intact so that you are maintaining form when you do have to pick up baby, hold baby, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Any other considerations for training in the pre and postpartum?
Yeah, I think
I know we talked about a lot and there's been like a lot of detail here, but anything that we missed?
Yeah. I think a lot of women are told to avoid rotation. I hear that a lot, like, oh, my care provider mentioned like I shouldn't get into a twist because it's going to be too much pull on the belly or whatever. But I would actually argue that you want to get into rotation because that's how we move, right? We're three-dimensional beings, and we want to be able to have proper core connection, as well as range of motion, in order to do the tasks that we need to do. So rotation is a good thing. Also, because your rib cage is expanding so much, the lateral edges of your trunk are naturally going to be very tight. And if those edges are very tight, that's going to exacerbate things like round ligament pain, that coning and doming. It can place a lot of downward pressure on pelvic floor. So actually getting into smooth rotation, it doesn't even have to be with, resistance. But I would say that's a really, really good thing to also have kind of in your programming, is rotation that feels good to you. And especially if, I get a lot of women who are runners and they're like, I want to get back to running immediately postpartum. Okay, well, we need to actually have rotational control in order to run. So I definitely like to incorporate that into the mix, prenatal and postpartum, for those folks especially.
It feels like you're baiting me into a conversation about bad fitness advice from doctors.
Oh yeah, we could go all day.
To not go too far down that rabbit hole, because I know that we can go down there. Yeah. I think the fair thing to say here is, look, they are trying to communicate very complex things in very short amounts of time. Correct. And so the quote unquote safe thing is to say not do it, because if you do it poorly or wrong or whatever, there could be problems. But like, proper intentional movement is always okay. And like outside of the pre and postpartum population, the whole knees over toes thing is the same thing. Yeah, if you put your body in end ranges of motion and you're being an idiot, you're going to hurt yourself, but your body can do that, and therefore it should just be intentional and intelligent about your movement, and you're going to be good. And so I think the same is probably safe to say for basically everything pre and postpartum.
Totally. Yeah. Intention is everything. And like knowing why you're doing something, right? Why do I want to do this? Or why, again, like that, comparing like why is this season going to be so important for the next? Like what am I doing in this season to influence what I do in the next? So yeah, going over your why and intention is super, super important, for prenatal strength and postpartum strength. Yeah.
Right. Now, we covered a lot of ground on training, and I told you that this might happen, that we might open up a giant can of worms as we're trying to, close down the episode. So we'll save this in depth for another chat down the line. But can you give some basic nutritional guidelines? And maybe, like, I don't know what they are, but maybe a good way to go about this is like, what are a couple of the myths surrounding pre and postpartum nutrition that are out there that are complete nonsense? I literally have no idea what they might be. So if there's any that you want to address, like, I think that would be maybe a good way to kind of just wrap this up, and then we can have a more in-depth conversation another time.
Amazing. Yeah. I'm actually not too familiar with myths around nutrition. However, I do think this is just true generally of women. We're just not getting enough protein in. So it's good to just think about like, your body is literally, all of your cells are made of protein, right? So we need a lot of protein in order to function properly, in order to have energy to perform and to produce force. When you are pregnant, your cells are now multiplying, right? And you have to provide support not only to your body, but also to this growing life. So increasing protein is like the number one nutritional advice that I can give to any prenatal body. And the same would continue for postpartum, right? Now you've given birth, now you're recovering and you're healing. High protein is going to support that healing. You also now are giving a lot of the nutrients that you are taking in to baby. So replenishing your body, just over and over again with more production of protein, is going to be the best move, for you. Yeah.
she's not pregnant, but if you are my fiance and you are listening to this, rewind that and listen to that thing about eating more protein.
Yes, it's so good for us.
I mean, listen, this is just, it's so good for everyone. And it, I don't know how you feel about this. I feel very strongly about this, that like, it is almost like boring and repetitive. And I feel bad sometimes about like saying things like eat more protein so often. But when we really think about like, what are the biggest needle movers in nutrition and training and whatever, like these are the things, like increasing your protein intake for all of those reasons that you just mentioned in the pre-postnatal population. But for literally everyone else, like that is the biggest needle mover. There's not, we didn't get into supplements and we won't talk about it now, but like there are supplements that'll do stuff that will help you. There are all, fasting this, calorie that, this amount of carbs, this amount of fats, whatever. But like all that stuff matters, but like not nearly as much as like, get your protein in. Like these are the things that 100%. That really move the needle. So I'm so happy that you said that as like here's the catch-all. Like if you got to focus on one thing, like focus on this with your nutrition.
Absolutely. Yeah. I find it a little humorous when I have a vegan or vegetarian pregnant body who comes to me like, we've been working together for some time, mid-pregnancy. She says, "Oh my God, I was craving a steak and I just had to do it. I just did it. I ate the steak." And she like, is kind of like hands on her mouth, kind of whispering it. And I'm like, I laugh and chuckle because I'm like, babe, it's okay. It's okay. That's literally your body saying, I need iron, I need protein, I need folates, like give it to me now. And that's a good thing. That's a very good thing. And I tell her, I'm so glad you listened to your body, because that's also like one of the highlights of pregnancy is that if your body is telling you something, you should probably listen to it, because if you do not, down the line, there's going to be a bigger alarm system going off. And it's not going to be that fun. And it's going to be a really inconvenient time. So yeah, I love when I get a vegan or vegetarian who's like, I needed that protein. And I'm like, yes, girl, get it.
Absolutely. There's so much truth in like your body kind of knows what's up and knows what it needs. Do you think 100%. Then outside of like that kind of scenario where people have like peculiar cravings during pregnancy, do you think that there's any connection between like maybe that food has like some nutrient that they need, or is it just like a weird thing like I was just craving pickles? Like do you think there's anything there? I don't know if there's any science to prove this, but like what's your what's your intuition on this?
Like especially in that particular like scenario, craving meat or craving protein, like that tells me that you are likely like iron deficient, or just you hadn't been, supplying you weren't aware enough to supply your body with enough protein, for the growth that's taking place. Right. So it might be at a time where there's this big growth spurt and the body's like, I need more nutrients. So yes, I would say that, the body is craving, that iron or, whatever else. There are women who have like aversion to meat. They're like, I don't want to touch it. Like maybe they were an meat eater prior to pregnancy, but during pregnancy, it's just not vibing for them. I'm saying, increase or supplement your protein in some other type of way, whether it be with eggs, or yogurt, or like the good old fashioned protein shake. But yeah, something of the sort. 'Cause we need to get it in.
Amazing. Reed, is there anything else that you want to talk about today before we kind of start to close this off?
I think we really covered a lot, and I'm afraid if I start something new, we might be here for another hour. So we can always save it for the next time.
Yes, we will. And I'll say before we kind of end here, this was Brianna's first podcast, and we have been dealing with some significant lag issues. So one, I apologize to the listener if our voices seem broken up, but two, it is not easy to like stay focused and stay kind of like on track when we're like, I don't know how many seconds off from each other. So like, thank you very much for battling through this, Brianna, because I know that it's not easy, and especially, first time podcast. Like, so thank you. Like, you were amazing. I learned a ton personally, and I'm sure that everyone else has learned a ton from this episode as well.
Amazing.
Can you tell us where people can get in contact with you? You've been doing like amazing like live videos every single day, or live trainings every single day on Instagram. Like, give people the rundown on all that stuff.
Yeah. So right now I'm offering like 10-minute morning movement on Instagram Live. So if you have Instagram, certainly follow me, or don't, but certainly join me every morning. We're doing just 10 minutes of movement, just feel good mobility. Sometimes I get into a little bit of core work, but I basically don't program it. It's kind of just like whatever's feeling charming at the time. This particular holiday season, I am kind of a little bit focused on like hips and lower back stuff, just because we're doing so much sitting, eating, traveling around this time of year. So just with that in mind, I am trying to incorporate movements that support that. But in terms of like one-on-one training and group classes, there's a link in my bio, where you can find out all the things about that. And it'll also include the link to my website. So yeah, accessible for everyone.
Amazing. And what is your Instagram handle?
My Instagram handle is briannahouston.co.
Perfect. I will put that in the show notes so it's easy to find, but briannahouston.co. Brianna, is there anything else, any message that you want to leave the people with here in closing?
I think it's so great that we even had this conversation. It's so important that women just get to know their bodies, specifically their pelvic floor, but just really kind of riding home the fact that like, if you can see a pelvic floor physical therapist, like that is also an incredible tool to have, because you're going to want support, as much support as you can get during that prenatal time, birth, and postpartum. So I would just add that, yeah, seeing a pelvic floor PT is a really good move for you.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much, Brianna. I very much appreciate it. Again, I learned a ton. I'm sure that everyone else learned a ton. We will do this again, and we'll get into more nitty-gritty details and, you know, the other avenues and things that are important with this conversation for sure. So
yeah, we got to talk about birth and postpartum
in the coming months for sure.
Yeah.
Yes, that will be next. So thank you for the foreshadowing. Appreciate it.
Of course.
But yeah, thank you very much. Thank you everybody for listening. I appreciate each and every one of you as always. Make sure you're following Brianna on Instagram, briannahouston.co. I will put it in the show notes. Tune into her Instagram lives, contact her for coaching and all the other things, and just follow along to get some good information. Make sure you give the podcast a like and subscribe, and share it with friends, share it with people who you might know that need to hear it, who are in this season of life, because it'll help them and they'll feel nice that you are helping them. Consider it an early holiday gift. But yeah, follow us, thumbs up, all the good things. We appreciate you. Go outside, be a good person. See you next time.